Good day, everyone. Why are money, politicians, deceitful news agencies, hallucinogenic drugs, and religions a danger to people? Money. Many people are unable to imagine life without money. Few people want to think about why we use money at all. Is there another way to distribute resources and products among people in society? I talked about such a method in the manifesto chapter of my free book, Simple Truths of Life, and I encourage you to read it. In short, money is just a barrier between a person and a product. People could receive vital products, including knowledge, absolutely free of charge, and all other products would be available only to working people, those whose activities benefit society. If people received products barrier-free, free of charge, then there would be almost no crimes. For example, prostitution would completely disappear. Other people would not have to steal to somehow feed themselves. And fraud would also remain only in history. Murders would also decrease. Even pornography could disappear completely, or at least it would be significantly reduced for sure. After all, that industry is driven by a lot of money that some people pay for some reason. Currently, the money has penetrated so deeply into our lives that talks about almost any issue inevitably leads back to money. You get sick, pay or continue being sick. Can't find a job because directors don't want to hire you. Look for the different job. Engage in prostitution, fraud, or stay on the street, where you are most likely to die in winter. Even education costs money. There are, of course, state-funded places, which is good, but absolutely everyone should receive knowledge for free. Money also plays a huge role in the elections of leaders and politicians, and that money sometimes runs the show, and not people who think they have democracy. And, of course, do not forget about corporations. Here too, money hinders progress. After all, if a person invented a new type of clean engine, then such an invention instantly jeopardizes the business of oilmen. Do you think they will let such an invention see the light of day and quietly retire, glad that finally the pollution of the atmosphere of this planet has come to an end? Then you can take the example of manufacturers of computer chips. If they have a technology that will increase the performance of processors by several times and not by several percent, and at the same time the production cost of such a processor will not increase much, then it will not be profitable for them to release such a processor right away. It will be much more profitable for them to release processors once a year that will be more powerful than the previous generation, but not above a certain bar. In this way, the company will be able to milk the maximum possible amount of money from the so-called consumers. Further, when I tried to publish the official Russian translation of Thiaoouba the Golden Planet, no one agreed to publish it. One of the reasons was the fact that many people write fictional stories about extraterrestrial races, parallel worlds, etc. And because of this, the real story of Michelle could not be on the shelves of Russian bookstores. Naturally, authors write such an abundance of books for money, and not because they have some very intricate story that will excite people's minds for centuries. Perhaps it will even be read in literature classes. No. It's just that people need to somehow survive in capitalism. So they add their drop to the huge sea of books written by exactly the same people who hope to become king or Rowling. And a few will become them, but not the vast majority, because it's logically impossible when there's an enormous abundance of writers and other factors. There are many other examples of why money is evil. I will read an excerpt from Michelle's book, Thiaoouba the Golden Planet, that shows very well why politicians are a danger to people. Start of quote. You are all in the same boat, and there is a useful comparison to be made between a country or a planet and a boat. Every boat must have its captain, but to run well it requires skill and a spirit of cooperation among the sailors, as well as their respect for their captain. If, as well as being knowledgeable, experienced, and quick thinking, the captain is also fair and honest, the chances are great that his crew will do its best by him. It is ultimately the intrinsic worth of the captain, regardless of his political or religious learnings, that will determine the effectiveness of his operation. Imagine, for example, that a captain had to be elected by his crew more for reasons of politics than for his skill in navigation and his cool-handedness in times of danger. To imagine the situation better, let's suppose we're watching an actual election. We're standing on a leading dock where 150 crew members are assembled with 3 candidates for command of a ship. The first is a Democrat, the second a communist, and the third a conservative. Among the crew members, there are 60 with communist leanings, 50 Democrats, and 40 conservatives. Now, I'm going to show you that this affair cannot be conducted appropriately. The communist candidate is obliged to make certain promises to the Democrats and conservatives if he wants to win, because he is only guaranteed 60 of the votes. He must convince at least 16 men from the other party that it is in their interest to elect him. But will he be able to keep the promises he makes? And, of course, the same applies to the other 2 candidates. When one or the other of these captains is at sea, he will always find that a significant number of his crew are fundamentally opposed to his having command, so there is always a significant risk of mutiny. Of course, this is not the method by which a captain achieves his command, fortunately. I merely wish to illustrate the dangers that are inherent in electing leaders on the basis of political bias, rather than for their ability to lead people, honestly, in appropriate directions. While on the subject, I must emphasize another point. When our captain-elect is at sea, he is the one and only leader of the vessel, whereas when a party leader is elected as head of state, he is immediately confronted with a leader of the opposition. From the very beginning of his leadership, whether his decisions are good or bad, he will be systematically criticized by an opposing party bent on his demise. How can a country be properly governed under such a system, Michel? Do you have a solution? Of course, and it has already been described to you. The only solution is to follow the example of the government of Mu. This is to place as head of state a leader whose unique goal is the well-being of the people, a leader not motivated by false pride or party, and personal pecuniary ambition, to do away with political parties, and the resentment, the grudges, the hatred that go with them, and to hold out your hand to your neighbor, to accept him and work with him, regardless of differences you may have. He is, after all, in the same boat with you, Michel. He is part of the same village, the same town, the same nation, the same planet. What is the house which shelters you made of, Michel? Of bricks, of wood, tiles, plaster, nails. Indeed. And what are all these materials made of? Atoms, of course. Perfect. Now, these atoms, as you know, have to connect very closely in order to form a brick or any other building material. What would happen if these atoms repel each other instead of combining as they do? Disintegration. And there we are. When you push away your neighbors, your son or your daughter, if you aren't always ready to help even those who you don't like, you contribute to the disintegration of your civilization. And this is what is happening on Earth more and more, through hate and violence. Consider 2 examples well known to all on your planet, which prove that violence is not a solution. The first is Napoleon Bonaparte. By the use of arms, he was able to conquer all of Europe, and he established as national leaders his own brothers to diminish the risk of treason. It is widely accepted that Napoleon was a genius and, indeed, a competent organizer and legislator, since 200 years later, many of his laws still exist in France. But what has become of his empire, Michel? It quickly disintegrated because it had been established through the use of arms. Hitler, similarly, sought to conquer Europe by force, and you know what happened there. Violence does not pay, and never will. The solution lies rather in love, in the cultivation of minds. Have you ever noticed that all around the world, and particularly in Europe, you had many more great writers, musicians, and philosophers emerging in the 19th and early 20th centuries? Yes, I believe it is so. Do you know why? No. Because, along with the advent of electricity, the internal combustion engine, the automobile, the aeroplane, and such like, the people of Earth neglected the cultivation of their spirituality and focused on the material world. Now, as the great Sauer explained, materialism poses one of the greatest threats to your present life and your future lives. End of quote. In the manifesto of my book, I shared my views on a new way of organizing society, which is based on that which people in Mu used to have. Sensational journalists. I will quote the text from Thiaoouba again, and then add my opinions. After politicians, you have the problem of journalists and reporters. There are some among them, also unfortunately rare, who try to do their job of disseminating information honestly and sincerely, attending carefully to their sources, but were greatly alarmed that most of them seek only sensationalism. Your television stations too screen more and more scenes of violence. If those responsible were obliged to study psychology before being able to undertake such grave responsibilities, a step in the right direction would have been taken. Your report seems to seek and even prey on scenes of violence, murder, tragedy, and disaster, were sickened by their behavior. The leaders of a country, the journalists, in fact anyone who, by their position, is able to exert influence on the people, has an enormous responsibility towards millions of people who are no more nor less than his fellow creatures. Too often, even those who have been elected to their positions by the people forget the obligations they have in this regard, until, that is, a few months prior to a new election, when it occurs to them that the people are dissatisfied and might vote them out. This is not the case with journalists, as they have not needed to inspire confidence in the people in order to attain their positions, and yet they have a similar power to influence in ways which are good or bad. Indeed, they are capable of doing much good when they alert public attention to danger and injustice, and this should be their main function. To return to the need for such high-profile people to understand and apply psychology, I will give you a good example to illustrate what I mean. On TV we see the following report. A young man has just taken a rifle and killed 7 people, including 2 women and 2 young children. The report shows the bloodstains and the bodies, adding that the killer had imitated the style of an actor, well known for his violent roles in films. And the result? The murderer is going to be proud of himself. Not only has he achieved national notoriety, he has also been compared with one of the most popular heroes of violent modern films. But, beyond that, another such madman who sees the reports and hears the commentaries of reporters who pay unwarranted attention to this odious crime will be inspired to seek his own moment of national glory. Such a person is usually a failure, someone repressed, frustrated, inhibited, someone ignored, who yearns for recognition. He has just seen the report and he knows that all violence is reported, and sometimes exaggerated by TV reporters and journalists. Perhaps his picture will appear on the front page of all the newspapers, and why not? Then he will go before the courts and perhaps be referred to by a name like Jack the Ripper or the Strangler with the Velvet Glove. No longer will he rank among ordinary mortals. The harm that such irresponsible reporting can do is unimaginable. Thoughtlessness and irresponsibility are not qualities apparent in civilized nations. That's why I say on Earth you have not even achieved the first letter of the word civilization. So what is the solution? Why do I ask such a question, Michelle? You have been chosen because we know how you think, and I know that you know the answer to your question. Still, if you insist, you will hear it from my mouth. Journalists, reporters, and anyone else whose function it is to disseminate information should devote no more than 2 or 3 lines to such cases of murder. They could simply say, "We have just learned of the murder of 7 people by an irresponsible lunatic This murder occurred at whatever location and is a sorry event in a country that considers itself to be civilized. Full stop. Those who seek their day or weeks of glory would surely sidestep murder as a means of attaining it, if their efforts received so little publication in return. Don't you agree? What then should their reports comprise? There are so many worthwhile things to show. Reports of worthwhile events which improve the psyche of Earth's people, rather than brainwashing them in a negative way. Reports such as the risking of life to rescue a child who was drowning, for example, or of assistance given to the poor to improve their lot. Of course, I agree with you entirely, but I'm sure the circulation of newspapers depends on the sensational news they contain. And there we are, back at the root of all evil that I mentioned earlier, money. This is the curse that undermines your entire civilization. And yet, in this particular case, the situation could be reversed if those responsible were motivated to change. On no matter which planet, the greatest dangers to humankind are, ultimately, of a psychological rather than material nature. End of quote. I'll add that, unfortunately, I have a good idea of what Sala was talking about. After all, in a way, I am that person who has neither a girlfriend nor friends. You can read my free book to roughly understand how it happened. This is a big topic. Not too long ago, I was reading a book by Elliot Rodger, a handsome young guy who killed 6 people and then himself. The reason was that he couldn't find a girlfriend, couldn't have sex. I know what he experienced because I have several things in common with him. He was shy and did not work on himself, did not teach himself to overcome shyness, and this is more than possible. I know this for a fact, because I was able to overcome it at some points in my life. I talked about this in my video about shyness, for those who are interested. The reason for shyness is very, very simple. As another example, that will definitely prove that Sao is right, I will cite Danny Rowling, who killed 8 people, and in court he said that he wanted to be a superstar like Ted Bundy. Or Canadian Robert Picton told an undercover cop that he wanted to kill exactly 50 people in order to be bigger than some American who killed 42, who he clearly knew about from the news. Nathan Leopold and Richard Loeb didn't want to be caught. They didn't want their names to be known, but they wanted the newspapers to write about their crimes. One way or another, they wanted fame. It makes you wonder if it's worth spending a lot of time talking about crime. As Sao said, say a couple of sentences and that's it. This girl also became a fan of serial killers, and because of the problems in her life, she began to follow in their footsteps by killing one person. Then we know very well the word propaganda. For me, it has become synonymous with lies. One country says one thing, and another says something different. Who to believe? Sometimes it is very difficult to find the truth, and it can take a very long time. Such brainwashing news, in quotation marks, is not acceptable in a civilized society. It's worth noting that this applies to all people who disseminate information. For example, I found out in the video of one popular American YouTuber about Danny Rowling. He uploads videos each week, and the multi-million-dollar views bring him a lot of money, which I'm sure is one of the motivations for continuing to make such videos. As you can see, we again come to money, the source of all evil. I don't want to say anything very bad about that YouTuber, and I'm subscribed to his channel because of his videos about paranormal events, and those about murderers help to learn from other people's mistakes, from the mistakes of the murdered. It's just that such channels could refrain from mentioning the names of the killers and refrain from showing their photos. Again, I'm doing the same in this video to show my point. Hallucinogenic drugs. I will read the passage from Thiaoouba again. Drugs, similarly, affect the psyche of the individual. Not only do they ruin physical health, they also reverse the individual's process of universal evolution. At the same time as they induce states of euphoria or artificial paradise, they are also directly attacking the astral body. I will elaborate on this, for it is of great importance. The astral body can only be harmed by two things: drugs and the vibrations occasioned by certain kinds of noise. Considering only drugs, it must be understood that they have an influence that is totally against nature. They remove the astral body to another sphere where it should not be. The astral body should be either in a physical body or with its higher self, of which it is a part. When drugged, an individual's astral body is as so asleep, experiencing artificial sensations that completely distort his or her judgment. It is in the same situation as a physical body is during an important surgical operation. If you like, it's like a tool that will bend or break by using it incorrectly, or for a task for which it was not intended. According to the length of time that a person is under the influence of drugs, his or her astral body is going to decline, or, more exactly, it is going to become saturated with false data. Recovery for the astral body can take several lifetimes. For this reason, Michel, drugs should be avoided at all costs. End of quote. Religions. As for religions, I would simply recommend reading Thiaoouba The Golden Planet. It has a lot of references to this topic. On my own behalf, I will say that I think that initially many religions were based on knowledge about nature and the universe, on knowledge about the superior intelligence, which created everything that exists materially. But over time, some part of the knowledge became distorted for various reasons. Sometimes this was done by accident, without malicious intent, but sometimes the distortions were purposeful and malicious. Because of such distortions, we have the devil, who does not exist, and many other things that have no reflection in the real world. Then the knowledge about reincarnation, which is extremely important for people, was removed from the Bible. So, speaking about the dangers of religions, we mostly mean distortions of the original teachings, as well as some practices that do not help people in their spiritual development, but rather, on the contrary, hinder their spiritual progress. In conclusion, I will quote the words of Sao when she finished her story about the dangers to people. Quote from Thiaoouba. Returning to the problems of your planet, Michel, the solution depends on love, not money. It requires that people rise above hate, resentment, jealousy, and envy, and that each person, whether he be street sweeper or community leader, put his neighbor before himself, offering his hand to whoever needs it. Everyone has a need, both physically and mentally, of his neighbor's friendship, not only on your planet, but on all planets. As Jesus said when we sent him to you almost 1,000 years ago, love each other.